Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the third webinar in our State of Phishing webinar series, BEC, Did You Get Trapped in That Conversation?, where we will dive deep into all things business email compromise and how to combat these elusive threats that are responsible for the loss of billions of dollars around the globe. Leading us through this conversation today is Tanya Dudley, Strategic Security Advisor at Cofense. Tanya focuses on phishing defense advocacy while demonstrating how Cofense solutions help organizations worldwide minimize the impact of attacks, thus reducing operations costs. Tanya evangelizes Cofense's approach to phishing defense and incident response to new and existing customers, prospects, and the information technology market through speaking engagements, publishing platforms, and numerous media opportunities. Joining Tanya today is Aaron Higby, co-founder and CTO at Cofense. Aaron has more than 20 years of cybersecurity and senior management leadership experience. Aaron also pioneered the best practice of phishing simulations, now embraced by security teams in every major industry. And under his guidance, Cofense has become the global leader in intelligent phishing defense, instructing millions of end users to recognize and report phishing threats and providing security operations teams with actionable phishing intelligence. And finally, joining Tanya and Aaron today is Ronnie Tokazowski, Principal Threat Advisor at Cofense. Ronnie has experience reverse engineering APT malware, trolling cyber criminals, and currently specializes in all things business email compromise. This includes researching victim psychology, collaborating with law enforcement to identify new angles to attack BEC, or engaging with private parties to facilitate better sharing across the security industry. So huge welcome to Tanya, Aaron, and Ronnie, and thank you guys all so much for giving us your time and expertise today. A couple of housekeeping topics before we get started. On the agenda today, we'll give an overview of who Cofense is and what we do, then an informative deep dive into business email compromise, including what BEC is, its history, current trends in BEC, and how to mitigate the risk of these attacks. We'll then open the floor to audience questions. And while we'll have some open Q&A time at the end, you can also ask questions at any time during the session using the Q&A window in your console. This webcast is being recorded, and everyone here today will receive a link to the recorded session once the webcast has concluded. And on the right side of your console, you'll find a copy of the annual State of Phishing report, as well as a link to sign up for the rest of our State of Phishing webinar series and some other great resources. And now that all that's out of the way, I will pass things over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Christy. And thanks everyone for being here today. Real quick, before we get started, we have a lot of content today because when it comes to BEC, we just really focus on doing a lot of research, and we're great to have Ronnie with us here today. But just real quick, who is Cofense? In case you haven't heard of us, you're new to hearing about who Cofense is. As Christy mentioned, Aaron Higby and Rohit Balani pioneered this whole methodology of simulating a phishing attack through our PhishMe platform. And so, it didn't take very long as they realized that, there's more to just training people on how to identify that phish. Now, what do they do with it? And that's where Reporter was born, being able to bundle up that message in a way that your incident response teams can actually action it, find IOCs in there, and then mitigate that attack. And then that's where Triage Envision really came, to help with those security operations teams to be able to manage those phishing threats. Intelligence is our curated, human-vetted phishing intelligence product that we actually use to enhance all of our products with. And then we also manage all of these solutions for you in our Phishing Defense Center. So if you have any other questions or want to know more about these products further, you can head over to our website and dig into any of these. So I do want to get started with this blog that we posted in 2015, and Aaron and Ronnie are going to kind of discuss this. But before we get started, just in case most of people have heard what business email compromise is at this point. Business email compromise, CEO fraud. In some regions they refer to it, but it's that phishing email that really has no links, no attachments in it, and it's really more of a conversational. And I'll let the two of these guys kind of talk into that a little bit more. But Aaron, would you like to go first and kind of like setting the stage for us on this whole conundrum that we're in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like talking about the history of this because, you know, like the Cofense methodology is we start from a base assumption that a fish is going to get in, so we need to get our humans better at recognizing it. And I really can't think of an example that really showcases that better than this. So this was 7 years ago when we blogged about this conversational fish. And the only reason that we had that sample is because we had employees that are like, this seems weird. And they clicked that report phishing button and we got our hands on it. And at that moment, I knew that this was going to be problematic for security professionals, because the entire ethos of how to identify in an automated way a bad email was URL analysis, attachment analysis. And really, if you didn't have URLs or attachments, most of those analysis engines would just let the thing pass through. And that's what attackers figured out pretty early on, is like, I don't need bad URLs or attachments. I just need a story. And if I can potentially spoof someone that I can identify from just cruising maybe the management team's webpage or just going to LinkedIn, then even better. And so we really kind of kicked that off and told the world about this problem over 7 years ago. And we were the ones that kind of came up with the idea, if we toy with these attackers, we can tease out their bank account numbers and potentially aid law enforcement in finding these compromised banks or potentially stopping the attacker. So here we have something that the FBI came out and called business email compromise, which was kind of a strange term for it, because at that moment in time, the scam really was about impersonating a CEO, trying to get a member of finance to process a fraudulent wire. And I wouldn't say that the attackers were that sophisticated. They basically had a boilerplate story, which was very much the same, that they would kind of cut and paste over and over again. But I think this was an aha moment for attackers too, because they were so successful in getting companies to wire money out. Then they started thinking, let's expand our thinking. What other business processes exist that we could potentially exploit in this conversational nature to get people to, give up money or for the attackers to get control of something. So this has been a problem since we really showcased it over 7 years ago, and it hasn't gone away. And what we're going to see in the presentation today is how this has grown to be something outside of impersonating a CEO. We're going to show you modern examples, and then we're also going to show you some of the current cutting edge research that we're doing to try to analyze today's variants of BEC.
And then Ronnie, I know that this was when you were here back then, and you have done a lot of work with starting up a BEC working group. And I think we're going to see some of the shift that we've seen throughout these templates, but maybe talk a little bit about how you started up that working group and then even getting law enforcement to pay attention to this a little bit.
Yep. So I'll have to tread carefully on how we talk about that, just because it is more of a private group. But the story that happened, and I've told this publicly and stuff, but what ended up, the way the story went was we had started tracking the BEC stuff back when this initially came forward. And Aaron, I still remember the day when we saw this, because it was the day I was in the office, and usually wasn't in the office. And our CFO at the time, he came up, he was like, "Aaron, Ronnie, what's going on with this thing? I need to know what's going on with this." So that's what really kicked it off, was he was like, something is going on. This isn't Rohit who's sending me this. Y'all go figure it out. And granted, we got told off to go do it, but we went and we started looking at it. And what we ended up finding out in tracking a lot of the stuff and actually following up with the scammers was that once we started responding back, we got responses back. It was something where we hadn't seen that in the industry before, because when it came to phishing emails at the time, Aaron, you nailed it. It was phishing URLs, it was exploits, it was payloads. It was 100% like that. It was very much a one blast and that was it. So what the scammers figure out in this case is, instead of setting up malware infrastructure, instead of maintaining that infrastructure, paying for the servers, paying for the services, paying on the underground, possibly having their stuff taken down in order to maybe sell a credit card, the scammers figure out, no, I'm going to completely shortcut that, send an email and ask you to do a wire transfer. And that's where we are today right now, is when it comes to business email compromise, this is hands down one of the top crimes, if not the top one. Can we go ahead and move the slide forward real quick? So
yeah,
when
I
it
was just
comes
going to say,
so when it comes to tracking business email compromise, I have tried so hard to try and iterate this. It's like we get so angry about bits and bytes being sent back and forth, but the truth of the matter is we're over $43 billion that has been stolen. That's not some marketing number that was grabbed out of thin air. That was every single penny ties back to a victim. And what the unfortunate thing with business email compromise is, it's not just these emails. This is not just the full scope of it. You've got romance victims that tie back to it. You've got check fraud. You've got consumer fraud. You have 24 other types of crime that tie back to this, such as unemployment fraud. We lost over $100 billion in that. We lost $72 billion because of SBA fraud. You have 100,000 victims that we just know about. And oh yeah, ransomware might hit $21 billion. So when I see the headlines about something else that gets encrypted, I'm like, how can I be worried about that and concerned about that? And like, ransomware is bad, don't get me wrong. But when you go and look at the losses and start comparing the numbers, it's like, wait, this one over here is a little bit bigger. So maybe we do need to kind of start thinking through that.
And like you say, Ronnie, this is very underreported. Like, this is only what has been reported today, because not every $100 gift card or whatever is being reported, right? From many of the victims. And so then kind of talk through, like, what are all of these different links to BEC?
Yeah, so the best way to think of it, and the way I like to kind of articulate it, is if you had somebody who was going to commit one crime and they committed 5 different crimes, would you say, this is the only crime we need to focus on, or would you account for the group doing the 5 other crimes as well? And that's where we are with this type of fraud. So a lot of the scammers do originate in Nigeria. I am not saying this is only a Nigerian problem, but the scammers behind it are Yahoo boys or Sakawa boys for those in Ghana. And what they will do is they will do a multitude of types of crime. They'll do BEC, invoice fraud, check fraud. They'll do phishing kits, direct deposit scams, all these other ones listed here. And that's the biggest thing that people need to take away from this, is that while BEC is just this one area of the pie, it touches all these other things that we're tracking. It touches all these other things on consumer fraud. And once you start looking at the problems that are related to that, with how a lot of these crimes don't get reported, how a lot of these crimes fall down at local police departments, how a lot of these crimes get caught in the middle of law enforcement because, again, there's certain thresholds that some of these things have to meet. It's a lot bigger of a problem than we even realize and that we're able to articulate. And that's the craziest thing is that go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, ETO, is that account takeover more on with the financial services? They tend to look at that side of maybe in their fraud bucket.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that would be account takeovers or credential phishing will be another way that people track that too.
Okay.
So Ronnie, we're talking about BEC, business email compromise, and I'm guessing like most of the webinar attendees today, they have some sort of cybersecurity role. What I think happens in our community is we get very focused on the threats that happen to our businesses naturally. I mean, that's what we're here to do. But are you basically saying the attackers that are behind this, they're just clocking in, just doing all sorts of fraud, and they're not necessarily focused on businesses. It's just one facet of fraud in general that they've been successful at.
Yes, and that's very much the case. And the reason that the security community even cares anything about business email compromise is because they started targeting their businesses. They don't want to acknowledge the 20, 30 years of fraud before that. They don't want to acknowledge all the other stuff that goes along with it. So we can sit here and be super hyper-focused on business, on BEC, or come to the realization, hey, there's a whole lot more stuff going on. And that's the route we need to go, is kind of start linking all this stuff together.
Okay.
So I think for today, we kind of focused on some major areas that we see businesses getting hit with. So I think let's kind of move along to what we like. This is the traditional one, Ronnie. Like, this is kind of where we saw it start, right?
Yeah, and this is what we would consider like traditional business email compromise, or BEC. And these ones are very straightforward. What they do is they try to pretend to be the CEO or someone in authority within the company to say, hey, I need you to do this urgent wire transfer for me. Initially, we saw them targeting controllers within the company. We saw them targeting anybody who had financial authority in order to do that wire transfer. So that was one of the initial pretexts that we saw with a lot of business email compromise was, hey, can you do this urgent transfer for me?
And then direct deposit scams, then we started to see this pop up, right? Because now it's all about the money, right? So what's the next thing I can go after to target the money?
I think this is a great example too. Like, because Tanya, when you opened up, you talked about BEC. This is a term that was coined from the FBI. I've noticed in Europe, I hear the word CEO fraud from those early stories. And this might be why a lot of people are confused, because this isn't targeting anyone. No one in finance. It's not impersonating the CEO. And this is really a conversation between an employee and maybe an HR benefits payroll manager.
And I know for me, the way I track it is I don't even track it as either of those anymore. I track it as dumpster fire, because it's a lot easier just to call it dumpster fire it is than use any of those other names with it. Because it does get very confusing.
Yeah, this is a very common one, and I think we can get into a little bit about why it's hard to even, put some automation to it, right? Because initially they went after keywords, right? They were using wire transfer, and then they figured out, okay, the financial services industry has shut us down there. We're going to divert to gift cards, or we're going to divert to these other things. But then now they've even changed the language in their scripts, right? Because of how, some of our security controls will look for keywords, and there's always ways around that, right? And so I think this is a really good example here where, it's very common. This is what we saw over and over again. But then as I prepare for every webinar, digging into what is the current threats that we're seeing, and sure enough, I find something new, right? We tell people, use your HR portal, and what do I find? The threat actor now saying, hey, I couldn't get into the portal. Can you please do this for me? Anyways?
Yeah, and for your scammers, that's almost a lesson learned there, because if you think about it from the perspective of the scammer, they don't know how a lot of our operations work. They're kind of flying by the seat of their pants on this. So they know that direct deposit works. They know that they can have it send an email and say, hey, let's go to send this email through human resources. And then when one of them figures out, oh, wait, there's a human resources portal, which is why a lot of people are saying that we're not going to do this. Let's go and change our tactic, and then we'll socialize that with others. And that's when you start seeing that shift. So yeah, as you said, Tanya, this one was a fairly recent one. I have not seen them saying that, referring to the human resources portal yet, but I will almost guarantee that over the next couple of weeks, we'll start to see that tactic shift where they change the direct deposit fish to include that as well.
Okay, and we haven't blogged about this one yet. The can I forward you a voided check? But what I'd like to do maybe after this webinar, Ronnie, is say, yeah, forward me a voided check, because I'd like to publish what that check looks like. Are they making it in Photoshop? Like, what is it that they're doing?
Who even writes a check these days, right?
Yeah.
Scammers do, or the victims do. So.
Yeah. And so now, this came to us, right? So what's our process? Do we have a backup? If they can't get to the portal, they just have to wait for the next paycheck, right? So then now let's kind of shift to this invoice fraud, right? Here's another example of, where do they go after to get money, right? And so obviously financial themes are always top of, when we look across all of our phishing tactics that come in, this is always a theme, right? Invoice, finance related things, right? Because it's getting to that. But here we have a BEC that actually doesn't have any of those things, and kind of talk us through what this thread jacking is.
Yeah, so for this one was a case of invoice fraud, where they went ahead and were trying to say, hey, there's this purchase order that's coming through. On the topic of thread hijacking, the way that those ones work is the attacker will usually compromise an account, and once they compromise that account, they will go ahead and lie in wait. And they will see, are there any purchase orders? Are there any invoices? Is there anything like that coming through? And once that happens, the scammers will usually modify the invoice and put their own information in there. And essentially what they're saying is, no, I understand that you're going to try and pay this thing, but put it through this other account here. And what is difficult with a lot of these attacks is it's very difficult for your end user to detect. Because when it comes to phishing emails, a lot of attackers will send their email blind. They have no extra context. They have no extra information. But now to your end user, in the case of where a thread has been hijacked, it's now a trusted conversation with a trusted party based on information that they know was going forward, back and forth. And now you're trying to have your user tell the difference between this email that they've been conversing back and forth with a person they've known for the last week versus this one over here that was just slightly different. Attackers have even matched the fonts and text and the way that they word things. So the thread hijacking side of this stuff is very difficult to detect, especially for your end user. And again,
I'm trying to imagine, Ronnie, how something like that even happens. So I guess if you're a large business, you have tons of vendors. Mm-hmm. And it's just a matter of one of your vendors getting compromised. And then what happens? Does the attacker just kind of control F in that inbox? They look for a word like invoice or purchase order, and then they just continue on an old thread?
So they'll do it different ways. So they will set up, so they'll either control F looking for those old ones, or some of them will even set up an email forward rule and actually modify the rule to look for like purchase orders and things like that. And those ones are especially heinous because your organization can do a password reset on the compromised account, but because those emails are still going out, like the password reset does not work. And that's what makes it very hard to actually detect a lot of those and see where they're going through.
Nice.
Yeah, so I think that leads us then to this aging report concept, right? Because these kind of all tie together, right? It's kind of a little tactic of, okay, we kind of maybe started here and went through the other way, right? Because it really kind of starts with, let me do some research, reconnaissance, and get some more information about who do I target, who do I go after. And this is kind of the starting point to some of that information, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with the aging reports, that's usually a listing of like financial transactions that owe you money. So it could be like 30, 60, 90 days of outstanding balances. And what the attackers are doing is they're trying to get a copy of that report. And once they get a copy of that report, they will usually create new infrastructure impersonating your company and trying to call in those debts. So if you have an outstanding balance of $40,000 with this vendor that you're working with, they're going to go after that vendor. And again, with what I was mentioning on the thread hijacking side, it's a trusted relationship with a trusted person. It's a known balance and a known invoice number. So for your end user, again, this stuff comes extremely difficult to actually detect. And with a lot of these attacks, with the way they're carried out, there's no malware, there's no payload. So it's virtually impossible to try and automatically analyze these from like we do with traditional phishing emails. And that's why we're trying to raise awareness on this, is because it's crazy with how quickly and easy these things completely bypass your email gateways.
Yeah, I think we even talked to...
report is problematic because this is a common report that your finance team maintains. It's a list of all of the outstanding invoices and the vendors. Oftentimes it might have maybe invoice numbers or purchase order numbers. And so when the attacker says, hey, I need your aging report to your finance team, that's a report they have, and they send it to the attacker. Now the attacker has a list of dollar amounts, vendors, invoices, and then they can really start to do some harm impersonating your vendors. So this one is...
Yeah, we talked to a CISO, Aaron, remember, in the energy sector, right? And he had a big issue with this, and it was his third-party supply chain that was, they were setting up spoof domains that were just like them, and then sending in, emails to say, hey, we changed our bank account. So it becomes a process problem then, right? And I know that, you kind of brought up the fact that, it's very common for businesses to change their bank so often, and that's a common transaction that happens, right? Go in and change the banking information.
Yeah.
Okay, so we actually have a couple examples of these where we have these two threads are not likely connected because they're different companies, different timing, but on the left-hand side, you can see I need the aging report, right? They're asking for that thing. And then on the right-hand side, you see maybe a sample of what that might look like, right? Hey, you know, we had some change, you know, we noticed that you haven't paid something. So can you, you know, direct that to me? These are a little bit old, but then again, digging through emails, I was able to find one that actually was in that our own team had found. What's interesting is we used to have a person with this name in our Phishing Defense Center that was never a manager and was never involved with that. So it's just very odd that how this one came in. But again, it's that using that same tactic. But what I noticed about this one that really caught my eye, Ronnie, and curious as you sift through these. So it looks like they crossed their script, right? Because they're sending it to the payroll team asking for earnings, but then it's the aging report, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like they've almost collided with their own script. Do we often see threat actors, you know, making these little mistakes?
Very much so, and you'll see cases where grammar is one of the big things in the scripts that do come into play there. But yeah, you do see a collision of scripts where they might call it this one thing over here, they might call it this thing over here, but because they don't have the knowledge and understand the business processes of how a lot of these things work, that's why you'll have a lot of that nomenclature break down. And even on the case of like the direct deposit scams, like they may call it direct deposit, they may call it payroll, they may call it 17 different things. And again, just like with the aging report, to a lot of them, it's more of a confusing concept of how these things work. So they're trying to find like, okay, what's the right word that I can use in order to make myself more successful, in order to kind of continue taking the money. And that's a lot of the way that their thought process is trying to figure, okay, what can I say that will keep letting me have money and keep extracting money, if you will.
I mean, a theme I'm seeing here too is the run-on sentences, awkward English word choice. Like Cofense, we're a private company. We wouldn't have earnings reports like a publicly traded company. And so this attacker is kind of experimenting with financial terms to try to sound more official here, but they really missed the mark on a private company.
All right, so we're going to move on to one that we all probably are very familiar with when it comes to gift cards, right? So, Ronnie, we'll kind of dig into this. And, I mean, we've seen even this one evolve, right? I mean, looking at the email that's on the screen, we see that it's very detailed, right, in their initial ask. And I think now we're seeing that shift to maybe a more precise one, which we'll get into right after this. But kind of walk us through what we're seeing when it comes to gift cards, Ronnie.
Yeah, so in the context of gift card BEC, we usually see a very big underlying theme across most of them. So usually the theme that they're trying to convey is, I need you to go do a favor, I need a task, I need you to go do something for me. Because at the end of the day, as humans, we all want to help each other. So they're very much playing on that emotion of just trying to help somebody else out. So what a lot of these attackers will do is, they will, once they have you and say, yeah, I can go ahead and do that task, what do you need? They'll usually say, hey, I need to go to your corner drugstore, your corner grocery store, and pick up some gift cards. And we've seen pretexts where it's as simple as, I need to get some cards for a meeting. I have a family member who has cancer. I have to try and purchase this because I forgot my niece's birthday. So they will cover the entire gamut of trying to convey that same story of, hey, I need to go and get this gift card. Most of the times when we see these play out, it'll usually be in like $100 denomination. So it's usually like 500 here, 800 here, 200 here. And once the money goes out, the scammers will then use that and convert that over to cryptocurrencies. And contrary to normal wire transfers that may go and cross like 7 different hops, they can quickly cash this out within minutes to actually have the gift card wired out and converted from dollars to Bitcoin. And it can be as little as 10 minutes in some of those cases.
I think an important note on this one too is the happens over SMS, because what I'm seeing in this gift card fraud is a lot of them are trying to take the conversation to either email or to voice or text. And so it might start off with an email, but the email might be requesting a phone call or something like that.
Yeah, and I've even seen instances where instead of phishing for BEC through email, it will literally be the exact same script copy pasted over to text messages. So now they're trying to do phishing over SMS as well.
Yeah, and that's exactly what, this was actually from one of my friends. She told me this horrible story, right? And we all have somebody that tells us the story. And so I said, send me the email. I'd like to see what it looks like. And so as you can see, send me your your mobile numbers. Now she's a COO that just started, and they impersonated her CEO. So she was brand new to the company. She knew he was traveling. So she, went right along with it and texted the person, went back and forth, and they even told her what gift cards to get. She was literally going to go to a different store. And then they, said, no, it's fine. Give me a picture of what they have there, right? So she literally sent them pictures of all the gift cards on the rack. And then, and then they want you to scrape it. And then, send them the pictures of the code, right? And she had gotten to the parking lot and she had scraped it off, and then she thought for one last moment, this still just doesn't feel right, which she felt all the way through the whole thing, and then actually called her boss on the number that she knew him by, and then he said, no, Ruth, I'm on vacation, why would I ask you to do this? And so she was able to actually go back in the store, even though she had scraped them off but not redeemed them yet, and they were actually able to give her money back. So, through it all, I was like, okay, Ruth, how did that make you feel? And she was like, I felt violated, and then I was pissed off that I, nobody helped me out with, trying to figure out, am I supposed to be responding to this person? So yeah, right, again, this goes to when you think all of the right keywords to detect in AI, ML, machine learning with our controls, right, they shift the conversation to somewhere you can't even detect that. All right, Ronnie, credential phishing. So when I saw this, my immediate response was, well, we would tag this as credential phish. What does this have to do with BEC?
Mm-hmm. So the question, I'm going to answer your question with a question. How do attackers get those email accounts for thread hijacking? They have to use credential phishing in order to compromise those accounts. And that's the way credential phishing is once they have that username and password, they will go ahead and go into the account. They'll scrape the account. They'll look for anything that they can use in order to try and commit fraud. And like we mentioned with the invoice fraud earlier, they'll go ahead and set email forward rules up in the inbox in order to account for that. And one of the biggest things for the security responders who are listening to this, a password reset is not the end of the story, because once those email forward rules are set up, then your scammers can go ahead and maintain persistence on that account even after 15 different password resets. So if you have the ability, go audit all your forward rules for your company now and see if there's any instances on that. I can almost guarantee you'll find some where one of those accounts was compromised and you didn't realize it. And that's an area where most organizations don't look, they don't consider, or when they go and do that password reset, they're like, okay, password reset, that's it. It's like, no, it's not the whole story. You got to clean the entire thing as well. So add that to your security playbook to be able to do that in order to help mitigate and remove those, I don't want to say soft infection, if you will, but remove that persistence that isn't even on the computer.
I know a lot of organizations, just as a matter of their general security practices, are basically, they've made the practice of sending out forwarding emails just banned it completely, put a technical control into doing that. But that is really something that a larger enterprise is better at doing and executing on than some of these small vendors that are getting thread hijacked in this world of BEC.
All right, so Ronnie, we mentioned in the beginning that there's a crossover between what we see in the enterprise and consumer focus. So I think the first thing we want to kind of, describe to us, how does this happen?
Yeah, so on the consumer side, the way I like to draw a line, again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but business email information security never really cared about Nigerian fraud until they started targeting their companies. But the problem was that stuff was persisting, again, 20 years prior to that. So that's where we see the consumer fraud side, where the general public is used as money mules. They're convinced by very complex stories in order to continue wiring money on the behalf of the scammers. Some of the stories I've seen are absolutely horrendous from the victims, but what happens is because of the lies that the scammers are telling, the victims stay hooked for a very long time. And the way that the rubber hits the road on this is when it comes to wiring money, when it comes to the VECs, when it comes to that element of wire fraud, that's where we see the consumer victims being used. So it's literally a crossover between the two, where your consumers are used to facilitate the business fraud. And if you go and ignore the consumer side, that would be like trying to ignore a hash or an IP address just because it was part of our sample. It's like you have to account for the entire thing and the entire chain to actually be able to understand and start defending against this.
Yeah, so and I think as we go in, oops, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say,
that kind of goes into the money mules, right? Like how complex that is, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're very much that underlying network that actually moves the money. So your scammers will have networks of romance victims, work from home victims, all these different victims that they may say, hey, I need you to open this bank account for me, and I need you to receive this $15,000 for my inheritance, or I have this really great business transaction that's getting ready to go through. And once we have this business transaction that goes through, we'll be able to live happily ever after, and you'll be a millionaire. And it's things like that that your victims are told that they don't realize is necessarily bad. I have heard so many times, and I was one of these people too, where when it came to working with the users, it's like, well, why can't they realize that this is fraud? They should know better. But as I started studying the psychology side of this, as I started digging into like the who'sy, whatsy of how a lot of this stuff works, it really kind of started to become apparent that a lot of the people who are pulled into this, a lot of the people that we're trying to educate, it's very simple. They have different knowledge. They approach things differently than we do. And it would be like another way to look at it is it'd be like trying to judge a fish because the fish can't walk. It's like, one, the fish doesn't have legs and it can't walk. Or trying to say, why can't somebody change their oil? They were never trained to do that. So just because somebody has different knowledge than somebody else doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing.
You know, like there are people out there are lonely, or you might have a senior whose kids don't call them enough, and now they get someone on the phone, and it sounds like this amazing offer, and it might be a little bit of excitement in their life. You know, this chance to potentially, you know, get a commission on helping someone route their inheritance. So it's sad. You know, they are really finding vulnerable members of our society in order to take advantage of them to move this money.
Yeah, and the loneliness on the romance scam side, we definitely see that. The loneliness is definitely a big thing. And the check fraud is another big one that we see too. So this is also known as advanced fee fraud, where the scammers will try and send you some money, or you might be trying to sell something on like Facebook Marketplace. And when you go and sell it, they're like, oh, hey, let me go ahead and send you a check. And that check just so happens to be for $2,500 more. So that's one of the areas that we see as well, is that consumers are targeted with this, is where they're trying to go and either sell a good, sell a service, sell something, and get overpaid for what they're trying to do, but actually don't. For many of the folks that are on this call, if you've ever tried to sell...
Let me ask you, like, what's the mechanics? Does the check end up not clearing? And then you've accidentally sent the attacker your money, and then that check ends up not clearing? Like, how does this scam even work?
So there's multiple angles to this. So it can work in the sense of being a fake check. It could be a forged check. And then what happens is you'll go to your bank and you'll go ahead and deposit it. One of the rules that is actually at the bank side, and this is for all U.S. banks. I'm not sure about the rest of the world. But for most of these banks, they have to guarantee that when you deposit a check, they will give you the money for that. So a lot of those scammers go under that to where they'll go and give you that check. One of the things a lot of people don't know is just because you deposit a check doesn't mean it cleared. So what happens is it can take up to 10 days for some of these checks to clear. And then once they go ahead and clear, it bounces. So your attacker now has a week and a half to try and convince you to send them that extra money that you were able to deposit. And once you go and send that money, you're the one who's actually stuck with that loss in your bank account and that extra $2,500 being out. So that's the way they play it. That's the way a lot of these play out.
So then we have work from home victims. Who knew these little signs on the road side of the road linked to all of this mess?
Yep. Yeah, and it's something where specific with the work from home scams, a lot of times where I haven't seen them with the ones on the side of the road, But the ones I have seen are where they will go and do a listing on like Indeed or any other job website, and they'll say, "Hey, I'm going to be working. You're going to be working for this really big company, but I'm going to pay you weekly." And that's usually the one gotcha there, where you can see is that if there's a weekly pay coming in, that's usually where it's going to be suspicious. So a couple ways I've seen this one play out is it could be something where they will have you go and buy a laptop, and then in order to quote unquote install their software, send the laptop off to this address, and then you're now out of laptop. I've seen it where they will have the person and have them actually go and buy a printer, buy a laptop, and use stolen credit card and stolen information in order to purchase that. And then what they'll do is they'll use that person in order to print those checks, just like we saw previously. So a lot of times when it comes to the consumer check fraud, those checks may not even be from the scammer. They may be from a work-from-home victim who is, again, kind of getting caught into this chain. And that's why I kind of want to reiterate here is that a lot of these things, it's a big chain of mess that with how a lot of these things overlap. And again, your work from home side is very much one of those.
All right, so we've mentioned romance victims a few times. So how does this all link back to BEC?
Yeah, so romance victims is one of those areas that business email compromise would look very, very different if romance victims were not in play here. So with the way romance victims work in this regard is you may have somebody who will go to a dating website. They may be on Facebook. They may be trying to find love. And Aaron, you mentioned it earlier. A lot of people are lonely, and we all just want to feel loved as humans. And that's a human condition. That's something we all want. That's something that we all need. So what happens is a lot of these people will go to these dating profiles and these dating websites in order to try and find that, just love. And what happens is the scammers will say these super loving things to them and be like, "Oh, you're my everything. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Or in the case of being widowed, they'll say, "Hey, I lost my spouse. I had 2 kids. I'm elderly. I just want somebody to spend the rest of my life with." And they'll be sending pictures, these loving notes. They might send flowers. They'll even send chocolate in order to try and get the people to fall head over heels for them. And once they do, that's usually when the relationship kind of changes from, "Hey, I'm trying to do this awesome stuff," to, "Hey, I need you to do something for me. I need you to go buy me a gift card." And they'll usually start small. And once they start small, it kind of snowballs from there to, "Hey, go get this gift card," or, "Hey, I need to borrow $30 here. I need to go borrow 100. Hey, can you go get this bank account for me?" Again, that all is playing on the human element of that. And it's something where once those romance scams start to carry out, your victims will become so emotionally entrenched in the relationship that they can't see through what they're doing. They can't see that what they're doing is fraud. So they'll go, again, they'll be opening bank accounts, they'll be purchasing gift cards, they'll be filing for loans. And again, a lot of this comes down to the human condition. And Tanya,
it sounds like they take quite a bit of time to groom them through this process, right? Like they are patient and they work through these relationships, right?
Yep. Yeah, and they're patient. They will work through it. And like I've seen cases where the victim was in it for over a decade. And again, that's over 10 years of conversing back and forth with somebody, trying to convince somebody. And from a lot of the victims I've worked with and seen, they literally, once they're identified, they literally become a shell of their former self. It's very hard for them to come to the realization that somebody would go and abuse them that much and steal the money from them, and it's literally a form of psychological abuse. And there's actually a psychologist out in Australia who did the research and backs that claim up. Her name is Monica Whitty. She did a great white paper back in 2015 that kind of walks through the psychological abuse for the victims and kind of how all that relates to them.
All right, so with all of this said, we still have to cover, even though we cover enterprise, there's always that lapse over, right, to kind of just get some insight. Yeah. But I think, Ronnie, I think Aaron sent you on a mission to try and see what can we do, how can we figure out what's going on here. And so this was our first initial email. As you can see, that's how, they were asking for wires. And what are they asking for today? Like we mentioned several times, it's quickly trying to get you off the email and into that next thing. So Ronnie, I'll let you I don't know, Aaron, if you want to add anything in here before
Ronnie. I'll set the stage. Go back one slide, please. So you know, this BEC email that we were talking about, 7 years old, was really slipping past the secure email gates because they weren't doing text analysis. It was primarily URLs and attachments. And this boilerplate story, are you busy? I need you to process a wire, worked well for attackers for a long time. And it wasn't until kind of the secure email gateway market woke up to, oh my, like we actually now need to start doing detection based on keywords in the body of this email, that they were able to even do anything about this. And so this was really easy for someone like in a SOC, because you could write some keywords, regular expressions, and find this type of scam pretty easy. But things have changed. You know, the modern BEC threat actors, and we'll go to the next slide, a lot of them are trying to either take the conversation off of email because they don't want any of these next generation segs to be able to detect their boilerplate messages, or that they'll try to use a very short message that would be difficult to interact with, because what they're trying to do is evade automated detection and automated analysis. And so I wanted basically kind of what is the state of the union for BEC in 2022. And Cofense is lucky in that we have a labs team that gets to go down the rabbit hole on these more long format research projects. And so we assigned this one to Ronnie. We said, we want you to interact with a bunch of attackers, and you can move on to the next slide. And we want you to find out how many of the phishing emails, percentage-wise, is it reasonable that we can identify with automated filters now, meaning the entire BEC story is intact, so that very first email is enough to go on in order to know that this is a BEC story, versus what is the percentage of these conversational BEC emails today that you actually have to interact with the attackers maybe 1, 2, 3 times in order to get enough material to know that it's a scam. So what's cool about this webinar is you guys are getting a bit of a preview of this research project that's in progress. There's going to be a more formal paper about it once we kind of wrap it up. But I'll turn things over to Ronnie because he was the one that was interacting with hundreds of attackers.
Well, yeah, so I think, Brandy, was this the first email, right? So we started with one email, right, that we took from one of our customers and then used that as the seed. Like we didn't create a brand new template, right? We took something that already existed.
Yeah, so we started. So what we did was we started with like the regular emails from the scammers and used that and modified it to hide the customer information, because one of the things, the way the scammers operate is they're sitting there copy pasting emails back and forth all day long. So what we did was, through some of the research that we did, the first phase of this was taking a small subset of emails. So we took 136 emails, and we wanted to figure out from what they say, what pretext do we know? What can we define and kind of look at this? So for starting the research out, of those 136, 82 of them you couldn't really tell what they were. As we found out, 44 of those were payroll diversion, 8 were gift card, 2 were aging reports for the weeks that we looked at that. For the second phase, we used 112 emails. Again, we responded back to the scammers and simply said, hey, we're going to try and essentially said, hey, we're going to engage with this. What can we find out about that? And from that, we were able to find that from the first email and from the first response, we were able to get about 35 of those where we knew what those were. After you respond back.
Frame this up for the audience, Ronnie. Are you saying that today, 60% of the BEC emails cannot be identified just on the first email alone, that it takes follow-ups?
Yep. In order to fully understand what their cash out method is, what their intent is, what they're trying to do, you have to respond back to that. Because it's something where they may say, hey, I need you to run this task, I need you to do this favor, but it's something where, is the favor going to get a gift card? Is it something where you're trying to go and do this wire transfer? And it becomes something where, in order to see how these play out, you have to have a conversation going back and forth with the scammers, and you have to converse with them. And that's what a lot of people don't understand here, is that with some of these ways, you can't even tell what the scam is or how it's going to play out until you respond back to the scammers. And that was one of the things that we found out through this, was that once we started just conversing back and forth with them, a lot of those things where it was like a task or urgent or run me this task, for the gift card side, that number jumped up almost over 300%, where once you started responding back to a lot of those attacks, it was something where right now a lot of those, hey, I need you to do this favor for me, a lot of those are gift cards, but it doesn't mean that the scammers won't change it at some point throughout that conversation.
So there were some interesting things you found along the way, right, Ronnie? I think this first one was very interesting. Like they didn't acknowledge that you were responding to them.
Well, so here's the thing. When we responded back to this one, we responded back to the account, and the user whose email account it was came back and said, hey, I have no idea who you are. This is probably hacked. And then like the following minute after that, we got a response back to say, hey, I'm sorry for bothering you. Can you send me gift cards? So, and it was from a completely different, it was from a Yahoo address, whereas the other one was from a BT internet address. And what the interesting thing on this is again, where we mentioned the account takeovers, we have mentioned the credential phishing, we have mentioned that you have scammers that will modify forward rules. This is it. This is the evidence of proof that no, scammers do this, because when they responded back, they were in the inbox. It was from a completely different address. They were within 1 minute of each other. So that's the only way in which these scammers could have maintained persistence on that and received an email coming back from the other person who was actually in there. And again, that's one of the biggest things to hit home here, is that they use forward rules to compromise the accounts and then send stuff on your behalf, and it's completely outside of your chain of visibility.
Got it.
And then?
And
then a little bit longer, right?
And then we also saw instances where they were doing like forged documents. So they were sending things like bank receipts and bank accounts, and to say, hey, and actually added information for headers to say, hey, this is what we need to do. The other cool one was in the fake account that we were sending from, they actually made invoices on behalf of our fake account in order for us to pay those invoices. So they didn't go and do the research to find out whether this was a real company or not. They just blindly trusted the email that they had in order to try and fill that out. And one of the things with that is they're so financially motivated on these things that they'll literally do anything they can in order to get $1. And some of the other plot twists that we saw with this and everything was that we also saw cases where it was kind of alluding to like romance scams. Can you hit the next slide real quick? So when they would do that, they actually will use people who are in the military or people who are overseas and say, hey, I'm this sergeant or this person here. And again, these were right from the BEC email that we started from. And again, everything that we started with and looked like it was going to be a BEC, but as it came off, it's like, no, I have this business transaction, I have this thing, here's this thing we want to do with much love, and here's my picture. So again, this is where we get those blending of threats between the romance scam and the BEC side of things.
All right, we're almost out of time, so I want to make sure we have a minute to kind of go over what we recommend as mitigation. So anything else that stood out here that I think you kind of covered most of these things as you kind of talk through that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that kind of stuck out was just that you have to have a conversation with a lot of these things in order for them to play out. Not in virtually every case, there's no malware, there's no payload, there's nothing inherently malicious, so it completely passes your email gateways, and we've seen this happening for the last 7 years.
Yeah. And I guess if you're in the SOC and you're hoping some automation is going to help you figure out what that is, it's not. Like 60% of those BEC emails, you'll have no idea that it was a BEC email until you've interacted with that attacker and got them to kind of give you the second part of their scam, and then you know what you're dealing with there. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, as you probably have heard through many of what we talked about, right, it comes down to that process and really just working with your business teams to making sure that they understand what their processes are, right? They're following those things. And I know it's in the smaller orgs, that's where you don't always have a big group to be able to have that SOD, the segregation of duties, to be able to do that. And then sharing and collaborate, right? as Ronnie has mentioned, like a lot of the work that has done from shifting it from wire transfers to gift card is because the financial community came together and started working together on kind of sharing what they have found. Educating your employees, right? This is a little bit more difficult than just simulating, right? And that's why we recommend using awareness newsletters, right? Actually taking emails that you've seen in your organization and sending, putting images of those in those newsletters so that your team can see what does it look like when these come across.
And if your employee actually,
yeah.
and I just want to add one thing there. If your employee actually speaks up and finds one of these things, award them, award the good behavior, because I've seen many organizations that will straight up shun people and like try and fire them because they click the fish. But it's like, again, it goes back to that concept of different knowledge. So different knowledge doesn't mean you're stupid. It's just you have that different knowledge.
Yeah, and then disable auto forwarding. We were working with an organization on one of the newer products that we have, and it required auto forwarding. And they're like, well, we have to put an exception for that. So I was glad that they had that control in place, right? So, find ways that you can disable that auto forwarding. There really shouldn't be. It's also in your insider threat program, right? There shouldn't be any reason for people to auto forward emails outside of your domain. And then CEO messaging, I always recommend to people, make sure that your executives are telling your teams and your all hands meetings that I will never ask you to go get me gift cards for any reason, right? Like, just make it clear, and making sure that as you're onboarding new employees, my friend, she was new to the organization, right? Making sure that you're also communicating that to your new hires as they come on. So we have 3 minutes left. I'm gonna let Christy kind of wrap us up here so we can kind of, if we have a minute to answer at least one question that came in.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Tanya. It's a pretty hefty topic, I think. BEC, especially, as we've seen, like threat actors getting more aggressive, and there's a myriad of tactics at play here with this type of attack. But yeah, so a couple of things. Our next annual State of Phishing webinars topic is the year of ransomware, tackle the phishing problem before ransomware takes its toll. As we know, ransomware has captured the headlines for years due to its sensationally disruptive nature. We see it in the headlines almost daily, I think. And phishing is now one of the primary entry points for ransomware operations, targeting entire organizations. So I would love for you all to join us on June 22nd to learn how to catch a ransomware operation at the phishing stage before it's even identifiable as a ransomware attack. And then also the following day, we're covering the latest and greatest with our product Cofense Reporter, Reporter SaaS, the easiest way to report phishing. So for anyone that's not aware, Cofense Reporter is an email client add-on that provides a single-click method for users to report suspicious emails to an internal mailbox that is typically managed by your security team. And then these reported emails aid in identifying phishing and other suspicious emails that have bypassed traditional secure email gateways and other protocols. And Reporter is now available fully hosted by Cofense with no server setup, no software to download, and deploys in just a few clicks. So those are our next upcoming webinars. Of course, if you haven't yet, be sure to grab a copy of the 2022 Annual State of Phishing Report. You can grab that right from the Resources Center on the right side of your screen. Now, obviously, floor is open for Q&A. We've got about a minute. I will ask this one question. It just came up, and I think it leans to what Ronnie was just mentioning about rewarding reporters. Recently I've had 2 SMS phishes from PayPal reported and sent copies of the text to the real PayPal fraud team, and as is often typical, don't ever receive any type of response. So the question is, do you think companies really use or appreciate people reporting these scams using their company name, or is this type of fraud report a waste of time?
So I would say with a high amount of confidence that when those things do get reported, they do get tracked and they do get logged. Following back with a lot of those things, especially for larger organizations, they more than likely don't follow back because it becomes a lot of extra work to follow back with the user has questions on that, who's now tasked for doing that. But I will say for a lot of the fraud that happens, and when a lot of those impersonations do happen, your fraud teams at those larger companies 100% do review that. So
the other thing I'll add in there, Ronnie, is you can forward that message to 7726, and your phone provider does also look at those as well.
Yep, that's true too. Yeah, so when you see something, report it, and you may not get that immediate feedback that somebody did receive it, but trust that it got to where it needed to, and something will be done. It is much better to report it and not hear back anything than to not report it at all. Okay, so we're now a minute over. There are definitely other questions I know we haven't been able to get to, but rest assured we'll follow up with you directly with an answer. And thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you again, Aaron, Tanya, and Ronnie for sharing such great insights today. And we hope to see everybody on June 22nd for the next State of Phishing webinar. And in the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.